So I'm going to give a talk. By the way, this is our team here, and some of them are the audience here. Is Gary Cooper and Jack Foster, Seth Jane, and is here, and Lee Galbraith, Bob Orman, and myself. So our talk is going to review some recent events in climate science, and so I want to make sure that you understand I'm not a climate scientist, and certainly not an eminent one like Ken is. And so these are my impressions that I've picked up over the last 7 or 8 years working with these guys. So then we'll talk about marine cloud brightening, our experimental work, how to do this, so some proposed field tests, and then some closing comments. So as I say, I'm not a climate scientist, and it isn't just global warming. This is really, the best name for this is climate disruption. So we have this commission, the IPCC, right? And it's been going on for close to 15, 20 years. And it brings out these reports. And the point of it is that these reports always seem to be behind the real facts. And the reason for this, at least according to Steve Schneider, is that it has to work by consensus. So they agree on something, and they work for weeks on one single word, just to make sure. So if somehow, Saudi Arabia doesn't like it, they buy out a few other guys, and they say, that's not going to go in the report. And so the result is that the report is almost optimistic. And if you see the trends that we have, they're always above what the IPCC says are just at maximum. So, the other thing that we face with this and so I have a different flavor on this, I can probably because I'm a little older, is that the potential changes that we face are so profound that it's very difficult for us to accept. And, so people try to scare people, and that just works the other way around, because we're not wired for this kind of danger. We're not wired for this. And, we know how to deal with dangers, that there's a bear there or a Russian bear, and for 50 years we do very well with that. But this is sort of long-term, and it's very gradual. And our DNA isn't wired for that kind of threat. So, this is according to Bertolt Richter, right, Nobel Prize winner at SLAC, the only field where the experts are more worried than the general public. And it's good when you bring these facts out. This is what Steve Schneider said, okay? The truth is bad enough, okay? There is no need to exaggerate. So, and I think our own inaction is by and large the most dangerous thing that we face. Right? So, why me worried? Why do 5 or 6 guys that are virtually retired spend 5 or 6 years about it? Well, maybe I'm not worried, but I'm definitely very concerned. So we now have these Paris talks, right? They're going to start in December. So 6 years ago, we can't agree on anything on Copenhagen, and we say, look, we're going to agree on this. We're not going to go above 2 degrees C. And that's, we couldn't agree on anything, but everybody agrees on that. So now we're going to these talks, and the president, the conference chair, has already said that we're not going to achieve these targets. I mean, that's on record. And the Obama administration, I happened to talk to somebody from NRDC, and the advisor from Obama said, they're not going to go in with that. They're just going to say, this is what we're going to do, but 2 degrees C is out of the table. We're not going to make that. So, there are all kind of unpleasant things that you can read here. For example, the US carbon emission, they're rising again. That's because we're doing very well. You have all the unpleasant things about the species, which not only coming from climate change, essentially, but, every day, when you go to the news, you find something that's very unpleasant and sort of seems to make it worse than it is, or that we thought it was. So one very eminent voice, for example, was a guy by the name of Nicholas Stern that some of you may know, and he wrote a report in 2004 and 2005. He was actually a denier. He was a very prominent economist in Britain. And he wrote this report, and he said, look, this is for real, but with a few percent here and there of our gross national product, we're going to have this under control. So this report comes out, very well studied. What do you know? So 6, 7 years later at Davos, I said, look, I got it wrong. It's a lot worse than I first thought. So for your information, if you haven't seen this in Antarctica, at March 24, we had a record of almost 64 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 32 degrees above the melting point of ice. We happened to be in South Georgia, and it was 81 degrees there. That was a little earlier. So, we don't want to know all this stuff because the environmental stories make up less than 1% of the headlines. That's really the fact. And Beyonce gets 11 times more mention in US media than stories about deforestation. And what really shocked me, I mean, some of you may have been there, we went to a fundraiser for environmental volunteers. So this is sort of a very informal thing, right? So that was just brought out last week. So 72% of the kids, these are 12-year-old kids, and they don't learn about climate change, they teach them about ecology, think that we're going to end up badly, really badly. And so when you don't believe in the future, you're going to discount it. And when you discount the future, you do really disastrous things. So is this the largest hoax ever perpetrated on the people of the earth? This is, this is Sir Bob Watson, who says, look, he said 3-4 years ago, forget about 2 degrees Celsius. We're on track for 4. And June 2012, so what I'm trying to say here, this is the International Energy Agency. The guy that's in charge of that used to be in charge of the oil cartel, right? This is what he's saying, okay? This is the World Bank reports. This is Munich Re, the largest insurer in the world. And Price Waterhouse, accountants for Christ, they're telling him, look, guys, we're on the wrong track. We've got to do something. This is another guy, Professor Peter Warhams, a very well-known guy in glaciology and all that kind of stuff. So you see in the background a submarine. So he goes in the submarine and has been going for 30 or 40 years, he's in his 70s now, and measure the thickness of the ice. It's not the extent of the ice that matters, it's the volume of the ice. So to read today, for example, that in Antarctica, the size of the Antarctica doubles in size every winter, okay? So now the ice is already double than it ever was. But the volume of the ice is much thinner than it was, and that's what matters. So here is another example, okay? So this is to the left is the IPCC production, and that we got another 50 years of ice in the Arctic. To the right was actually happening, okay? So by 2020, there is probably a 50-50 chance that the ice is gone. In fact, 2 of the guys that work with us, they have a bet. And they have a bet that by September 2016, the ice of the Arctic will be gone. That's probably a little dicey, but anyway. But just as a tragic consequence, just 2 weeks ago, right, there were 2 Dutch researchers that went to the Arctic, and they were making a survey and a movie that's called The Last Ice Survey. Both of them drowned through the ice, descent through it. This is the ice melt in Greenland. So red is the way it used to be on the left, and right is when it's melting. So, until a few years ago, just the outside was melting. Now everything is melting. Now, to tell you the truth, apparently this has happened before, and so this may be just a coincidence, but, it's not a good sign. So why are we doing all this? And this is a very interesting concept that came from Malhotra at SRI. If you take all the energy that we use, right, in the world, it's equivalent to 3 cubic miles of oil, right? It's not that we use 3 cubic miles of oil, but if you take all the energy and you burn it into electricity at sort of 35%, that's the equivalent that we have. So mile by a mile by a mile. And you got 1.3 times 10 to the 14 kilowatt hours. That doesn't mean anything, of course. But if you go on your bike, right, and you ride really hard, you can brew up to about 125 watts. You do that for 8 hours, you do 1 kilowatt hour. So the amount that we have is equivalent to 50.43 years for everyone, baby, mother, whatever it is in the world. That's what we do. And that could double if it's so. Now, that's the bad news. The good news, if you see the sun there, the sun delivers in 1 hour the same amount, essentially, of that 3 cubic mile of oil in 1 hour. So this is the best graph that I know, not everybody agrees on that, of what happened in the last 12,000 years, published in Nature. So for the last 40, 50,000 years, we've been going up and down and pushed left and right, right? And I don't know if some of you have seen this movie, The Cave, but it's sort of striking. It's this French cave that they found a few years ago. The movie wasn't out for very long, and you can't go to that cave either. But basically, there are drawings in there that are just astounding, really astounding. They're like Picasso. So what that tells you that 45,000 years ago, we already got very well-functioning brains. But we didn't make any cities. And when we came in this period, 12,000 years ago, which is called the Holocene, all at once, we had cities in the Middle East, and as it turned out now in South America and all that kind of stuff, in a few thousand years. And so what you see here is that we come out of this ice period, And we gradually go down, and then we're going into the next ice age until the Industrial Revolution, and then we speak up. That doesn't mean it's cost, but it's certainly a very strong correlation. So this is, there were no temperatures. How do you measure that? We get 60 different proxies. You get tree rings, you get shells, isotopic ratio, and that's how you do that. And so this you have to average it over all that stuff. So this is, well, I can't do this, so I'll skip it. So, there are other things that sort of make somebody wake up at night. This is methane that's frozen into the ice. So in the Arctic region, there are vast regions that have clathrates, which is sort of a frozen thing. And if I'm not mistaken, that stuff came out once before. That's when we had, basically crocodiles in Antarctica and all that kind of stuff. So these are things that are not put in the IPCC models. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ken. We sort of fear of that. The first thing we started seeing this methane coming out a few years ago, it was a few 100 meters wide. It's now go to some of these plumes are a mile wide. And last year we started seeing explosion of the tundra where sort of the thing sort of pops up. There were guys that at that time making a climate, they were trying to sort of real emergency stuff, and that sort of have died. So maybe it isn't quite as bad as we think, but the signs are not good. So ask is for real. Ask the insurance companies. Man, they have seen this. They have done this path, okay? You see how this goes up, essentially, and the wildfire is the same with everything. So the poster child for this is really Australia, right? In 2013, they ran out of colors. So the highest temperature was close to 50 degrees Celsius. That's 122 Fahrenheit. And that was followed 2 weeks later by days and days of rain of 14 inches a day until the rivers were sort of 23 meters, 60 feet above what it was. Yet Australia now is the largest denier of climate that there is on this world. I mean, they're governed, I'll come back to it. So what is this 2 degrees C? So the IPCC makes this, so what's red there is bad, and they have various categories and all that kind of stuff. So what's red is bad, and what yellow and white is sort of acceptable stuff, right? You've seen that from 2001, this is IPCC data, to 2009, what we believe to be the danger of 2 degrees C have substantially become redder, which is worse. So, and I don't know what has happened since, but anyway. So the question is, will we be out on maximum 2 degrees C? The simple logic says no. Because we dump about 36, or depending on who you listen to, gigatons. That's 1 billion tons of CO2 in the air. And it's increasing 3% per year. And I think people say around 1,000 gigaton, that's when we're going to reach 2 degrees C. So we got about 16 years left, okay, before we're there. That doesn't mean that we'll be 2 degrees C warmer, but it's unavoidable that we're going to get there. So what happens is we have about 5 times more in reserve that we already know. Okay, between the oil, the gas, and the coal, we have already 5 times more that's there. And until, not probably this year, we spend about 400 billion a year, okay, to find more of it. So the problem is that we're facing, and we face all of this, it's not just the oil companies, okay? There's $30 trillion of assets that are sitting there that we're going to say, if you want to stop at 2 degrees C, these are stranded assets. And the value of the oil companies is not put up by what they bring out today. It's what's in the ground that determines their value. So the other thing is that, and the reason why we think this is really man-made, I mean, this is going so much faster, and this is a quote from Stanford, than we've seen in any of the past that we can surmise. And this is why it's very likely man-made. And think about it. You're just not going to get away with burning the assets that are underground, the sequestered carbon that the sun has put there over 300 million years. And you think you're going to do that in a couple hundred years and get away with it? It's just not going to work. So I'm going to talk a little about occasional shift with large consequences, right? So the concept from Hansen. I'm sorry I don't have the thing here. Maybe I can try this here. So if you have a temperature over here that measure the temperature of a particular place, it's sort of like a Gaussian curve, a bell curve, right? And has a certain standard deviation. And what you see is that over time, over the last 20 years, that curve has moved, okay? And the curve that used to be green, we shifted a little bit to the right, the temperature increased, about 0.8, 0.9 degrees C. It's not a big deal, right? it is not a big deal, but it has large consequences. And the consequences is that when you take things that are 2 standard deviations away, so 2 sigma, that becomes 1 sigma. 3 standard deviation becomes 2 sigma, and 4 standard, 4 becomes 3, et cetera, et cetera. So for daily events, okay, everything that happens every week is going to start happening twice a week. It's not a big deal because it's not very fine, okay. Yearly events now become every 3 weeks. Things that happen every 43 years become yearly. That's why we have Catarinas and all that kind of stuff, essentially. And the things that happen so in 5,000 years now, right, are going to happen twice in your lifetime. That's the reality of it. So when we move it only 1 sigma, when we move it 3 sigma, I mean, you basically have a biblical event, every 2-3 years. And so for, a very evolved society like us that has a lot of infrastructure, it's very difficult to cope with that. If you live in the brush and your head blows off, you go back and make another one, right? I mean, these crocodiles lived in a temperature that was 4 or 6 degrees fine, and they seem to have done fine. But for us, it's very difficult. When you destroy a bridge, okay, if it will happen in 100 years, you say, well, fine, it's time to rebuild it. When you have to do it every 5 years, you just can't keep on doing that. So it's a very much larger burden. Ken has discussed about that. Basically, you take nuclear stuff, that's gone 1,000-fold down in about 1,000 years. Depending how big a pulse you take, if you take the CO2, it's a very large pulse. 1/3 of it is here 10,000 years later. So, why is this so difficult for us to believe it, for the fight that it is? Because there's a lot of money that doesn't want you to believe it. That's the problem. And so there was Naomi Oreskes, who used to be at Stanford, is now at Harvard, wrote a book out about this. And the people that oppose this isn't so much for money or whatever it is, not certainly these scientists, but the fact is that the government would have to come in and regulate us to do things. And once we're on that, we're slip-sliding into socialism, and that's the end of everything. And really, so if you look at the papers here, there are, over the last 4,000 summaries, 97, 98% said, like, look, there is unambiguously man-made global warming. And yet, this is what we end up with. This senator, who thinks he's doing God's work, says this is the greatest hoax. And so this is because the U.S. government, his theory is that the U.S. government wants you to make this. So you take the Australian guy, this is a quote from yesterday, okay? He thinks this is the UN. The UN wants to take control of it, and this is why we have to do all this stuff.